I spent $80,000 on a family vacation to California for my 70th birthday. But standing on the freezing concrete curb at the airport, my only son looked me dead in the eye and told me to go home because he forgot to buy me a ticket. They planned to leave me behind from the very beginning, taking my money to fund their luxury escape. The very next day, I woke up to 75 frantic missed calls. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little lives and made them pay for every single ounce of disrespect, let me know which city or state you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that family who treats you like a personal bank account deserves to face the ultimate consequences. My name is George Bennett. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building skyscrapers in Chicago and a lifetime building a safety net for my family. But that morning at O'Hare International Airport, the entire foundation of my life crumbled in an instant. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was brutal, whipping through my thin wool coat as I stood at the drop-off zone of Terminal 3. The heavy smell of jet fuel and exhaust fumes filled my lungs. I had insisted on driving my own SUV to the airport, wanting to make sure we had plenty of room for the luggage. For the past 10 minutes, I had been pulling heavy oversized designer suitcases out of the trunk, my bad knee aching with every lift. I stacked them carefully on the sidewalk. I was exhausted, but practically buzzing with excitement. We were supposed to be flying first class to Los Angeles to spend a month at a beachfront estate in Malibu. It was the birthday trip of a lifetime. I closed the heavy trunk of the SUV and wiped the sweat from my forehead. I turned to my son Matthew, holding out my hand. I asked him to pull up my boarding pass on his phone so we could go inside and check the bags. Matthew froze. He was 38 years old, wearing a tailored cashmere sweater paid for by my credit card, but in that moment he looked like a guilty teenager. He refused to meet my eyes. He stared down at the scuffed toes of his expensive leather loafers. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, broken only by the blaring horn of a taxicab pulling up behind us. Then my daughter-in-law Nicole stepped forward. She was 35, immaculate, her blonde hair perfectly blown out, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. She looked right at me and her lips curled into a bright, chilling, and completely hollow smile. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on my arm and told me that they did not have a ticket for me. She spoke to me with the slow, condescending tone one might use to soothe a confused child. She explained that Matthew had been under so much stress lately, and their marriage really needed a private couples retreat. She looked me in the eye and thanked me for funding their much-needed healing journey. She said I should just take the car and go back home to rest. The words hit my chest like a physical blow. I stood completely paralyzed on the concrete. The wind roared around us, but all I could hear was the rushing blood in my ears. A healing journey. I repeated the words in my mind, trying to make sense of the absolute absurdity of the situation. I looked back at Matthew silently, begging him to say this was a cruel joke to tell his wife to stop playing games. But my son simply reached into his pocket, pulled out the spare key fob to my SUV, and pressed it into my open palm. He mumbled a pathetic apology, claiming they would call me when they landed. He grabbed the handles of their massive suitcases and turned his back on me. Nicole offered one last patronizing wave before linking her arm through his. Together they walked through the automatic sliding glass doors of the terminal, disappearing into the warm, brightly lit building, leaving me standing alone in the freezing cold. They did not look back, not even once. I stood there clutching the cold plastic key fob, feeling the sharp, jagged edges of betrayal tear through my chest. The airport security guard blew his whistle, yelling at me to move my vehicle from the loading zone, but my feet felt cemented to the pavement. My mind violently rewound through the past 3 months, connecting every sinister dot I had willingly ignored. Exactly 90 days ago, I had wired $80,000 in hard-earned cash directly into Matthew's checking account. It was the sum total of the budget for my 70th birthday celebration. Nicole had convinced me that her close friend was an elite luxury travel agent who could secure a private oceanfront compound in Malibu, complete with a private chef and VIP vineyard tours at a steep discount. All they needed was the cash up front to bypass the corporate booking fees. I trusted them completely. I had spent my entire adult life trusting them and sacrificing my own comfort to ensure their success. When my wife passed away a decade ago, I threw myself into my engineering firm, working grueling 80-hour weeks to build a small empire of wealth. I paid for Matthew to attend an expensive private university, only for him to drop out in his junior year. I bailed him out of 2 failed startup businesses without ever demanding a return on my investment. Even now, Matthew and Nicole were living rent-free in a beautiful 4-bedroom suburban home that I legally owned and paid the property taxes on. I had always believed that a father's duty was to provide an unbreakable safety net. I thought I was buying their love, or at least their basic respect. Instead, I had inadvertently trained them to view me as nothing more than a bottomless ATM, an annoying obstacle attached to a bank account. They had played me for a fool. Nicole had never used a travel agent. The hushed phone calls, the glossy brochures she left on my kitchen counter, the enthusiastic dinner conversations about morning walks on the beach. It was all an elaborate, meticulously crafted stage play designed to separate an old man from his life savings. They had spent 3 months smiling in my face, eating the food I bought, while living in the house I owned, all while quietly plotting to abandon me on the curb like a piece of unwanted luggage. The sheer cruelty of it was staggering. They did not just steal my money. They stole my dignity. They had let me pack my suitcase. They had let me cancel my golf league and tell all my friends at the Rotary Club about my wonderful family vacation. They had let me drive them to the airport, acting as their personal chauffeur, to the very gateway of their stolen paradise. The security guard blew his whistle again, much louder this time, stepping toward me with an aggressive glare. A younger version of myself might have stormed through those sliding glass doors. I might have marched right up to the first-class check-in counter, grabbed my son by his expensive collar, and demanded my money back in front of hundreds of strangers. I might have screamed until my throat was raw. But I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. A profound icy calmness washed over me, numbing the pain in my chest and replacing it with something far more dangerous. Absolute, unshakable clarity. I slowly walked to the driver's side of my SUV and climbed in. The interior of the car was still warm. The sickeningly sweet scent of Nicole's expensive floral perfume still lingered heavily in the air conditioning vents. I rolled all the windows down, letting the freezing Chicago wind blast through the cabin to scrub their presence from my space. I put the car in drive and pulled away from Terminal 3. The drive back to the suburbs felt like crossing into a new reality. I merged onto the Kennedy Expressway, the tires humming a steady rhythm against the asphalt. With every mile marker I passed, the devastated, heartbroken father faded away. In his place, the structural engineer emerged. My entire career had been based on calculating load-bearing limits, finding structural weaknesses, and executing controlled demolitions. Matthew and Nicole thought they had pulled off the perfect crime. They thought my love for them made me weak, blind, and helpless. They assumed I would just go home, cry in my favorite armchair, and forgive them the moment they brought me a cheap souvenir from the boardwalk. They fundamentally misunderstood the man they had stolen from. They had built their entire lavish lifestyle on a foundation of my money, my credit, and my property. And as I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street and parked in my empty driveway, I realized exactly what I needed to do. I was going to systematically dismantle their world. I was going to cut every financial wire pull, every legal support beam, and watch their entire arrogant lives collapse into dust. I walked up to my front door, unlocked it, and stepped into the absolute silence of my house. The time for being a loving father was over. It was time to make an adjustment. I turned the heavy brass key in the front door of my house and pushed it open. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old books greeted me, but the silence inside was absolute and heavy. Usually returning from a canceled trip would bring a crushing wave of disappointment. A normal man might have dropped his suitcase in the hallway, slumped into the worn leather recliner in the living room, and surrendered to the heartbreak of being discarded by his own flesh and blood. I did not do that. I left my suitcase standing perfectly upright next to the umbrella stand. I took off my wool coat, folded it meticulously over the back of a dining room chair, and walked right past the fireplace. The mantel was lined with framed photographs of a family that no longer existed in my mind. There were pictures of Matthew as a young boy playing baseball, pictures of his college graduation, and pictures of his lavish wedding. I did not spare them a single glance. Those photos belonged to a past that had just been burned to the ground at the airport. My grief had completely evaporated during the drive home, replaced by a cold and mechanical focus. I bypassed the comfortable living quarters entirely and walked straight down the long hall to my home office. This room was my true sanctuary. It was not decorated with sentimental items or soft furnishings. It was a space built for absolute precision and work lined with solid oak bookshelves filled with engineering manuals, building codes, and architectural ledgers. This was where I had spent 40 years calculating the exact tensile strength of steel beams and predicting the breaking points of massive concrete structures. I sat down in my heavy desk chair and pressed the power button on my desktop computer. The machine hummed to life, the soft blue light of the large monitor illuminating the dark, quiet room. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out my wire-rimmed reading glasses. I put them on, feeling the familiar weight settle on the bridge of my nose. With that simple motion, I completely ceased to be a grieving father. I became a forensic auditor investigating a catastrophic structural failure. My son and his wife had treated my bank account like a public fountain, taking whatever they pleased while assuming the source would never run dry. They believed I was just a tired old man who did not understand modern banking, routing numbers, or digital transfers. They were incredibly mistaken. I opened my internet browser and navigated directly to my primary wealth management portal. The screen loaded instantly, displaying the complex web of checking accounts, high-yield savings portfolios, and large lines of credit I had meticulously built over 4 decades. My hands were perfectly steady as my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed in my master password without hesitation. I did not feel angry or betrayed in that moment. I felt an intense burning curiosity to see exactly how deep the rot went into the foundation of my finances. I needed to see the blueprint of their betrayal written out in black and white. I clicked on the Detailed Transaction History tab and set the search filter for the past 90 days. The numbers populated the bright screen in neat, orderly rows. It was time to systematically follow the money and find exactly where my $80,000 had actually gone. The quietness of the empty house, which was supposed to be my prison for the next month, now served as the perfect environment for absolute concentration. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, ready to dissect every single lie they had ever told me. The mechanical keyboard clicked loudly in the silent room. I typed the web address for my private wealth management portal. The screen transitioned to a crisp white login page. I entered my secure username and my 32-character password. The system paused, requiring a 2-factor authentication code. My cell phone vibrated on the wooden desk. I picked it up, read the 6-digit security code, and typed it into the empty boxes on the screen. I hit the enter key. The blue loading circle spun for exactly 3 seconds before my entire financial life materialized before me. I possessed a highly structured portfolio. It was divided into primary checking, high-yield savings, municipal bonds, and a dedicated trust account. I did not care about the total balance at the top of the screen. I only cared about the specific outflow of $80,000. I navigated to the transaction menu and selected my primary liquid savings account. I clicked on the advanced search function. I set the date range to begin exactly 90 days ago, the 2nd week of October. That was the week Nicole sat at my kitchen table drinking my coffee and explaining that her exclusive travel agent needed a direct cash transfer to secure the Malibu estate. I filtered the search results to only show outgoing wire transfers. The screen refreshed. A single line item appeared. October 14th. Outgoing wire transfer. The amount was exactly $80,000.00. I clicked on the blue hyperlink attached to the transaction confirmation number to open the detailed receipt. The digital document loaded, displaying the origin and destination data. The funds had successfully cleared my account and landed in a checking account at a completely different banking institution. I recognized the routing number and the last 4 digits of the destination account. It was Matthew's personal checking account. The transaction status was permanently marked as settled. The money had been delivered precisely as requested. If their story had been true that $80,000 would have been immediately forwarded from Matthew's account to a licensed luxury travel agency, I needed to verify if that secondary transaction ever took place. Because I had financially supported Matthew for his entire adult life, I still had access to his banking records as a joint account holder on his oldest checking account. He had opened it during his freshman year of college, and we had simply never removed my name. He likely forgot I still had digital access. I opened a new browser tab. I typed in the web address for his specific bank. I used my legacy login credentials. The system accepted them instantly. Matthew's financial dashboard loaded. It was a chaotic mess of overdraft protection transfers and high credit utilization warnings. I ignored the alerts and went straight to his transaction history. I set the calendar filter to begin on October 14th, the exact day my $80,000 landed in his account. I hit search. The data populated instantly. I saw the massive deposit appear in green, my hard-earned money sitting in his digital ledger. I then began scrolling down, tracing every single outgoing payment from that day forward. I was looking for a massive wire transfer to a travel agency. I was looking for a corporate booking fee. I read line after line of his daily spending. October 15th. An $800 charge at a high-end steakhouse downtown. October 16th. A $2,000 charge at a luxury boutique for women's shoes. October 18th. A car payment for a European sports sedan. But then I found the anomaly. On October 20th, there was a massive outgoing wire transfer. But it was not for $80,000. It was for exactly $65,000. And the recipient was not a travel agency. I clicked on the wire transfer confirmation code to pull up the destination details. The money had been sent to a private wealth management institution known for handling offshore shell corporations. The recipient name was listed as Emerald Horizon Limited Liability Company. I opened a 4th browser tab and accessed the Public Business Registry database for the state of Delaware. I typed in Emerald Horizon. The search results generated a digital incorporation document filed just 2 weeks before I handed over my money. I scrolled down to the bottom of the legal filing to find the registered agent. The name printed in bold black letters was Nicole Bennett. The scope of the fraud crystallized on my glowing monitor. They did not just spend my money on expensive dinners. Nicole had meticulously orchestrated a corporate shell game. She had convinced me to hand over cash under the guise of a vacation, funneled the majority of it into a private offshore entity completely under her control, and left the remainder in Matthew's checking account for their daily luxury expenses. They had systematically laundered my birthday fund into their own private wealth reservoir. But this raised a critical structural question. If they hid the cash in a shell company, how did they actually pay for the first-class plane tickets and the beachfront estate in Malibu? The airline and the property managers would have demanded payment up front. They could not have booked the trip with empty promises. There had to be another financial mechanism at play. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of my office, letting the problem turn over in my mind. Then the answer hit me with terrifying clarity. I sat forward and closed the tab for Matthew's checking account. I opened another tab and navigated to the American Express portal. I hold a premium platinum account with an exceptionally high credit limit built upon 40 years of perfect payment history. 10 years ago, when Matthew was struggling to launch his first business, I issued him a gold card attached to my primary account. He was an authorized user. I paid the bill every month in full to protect my credit score, but I rarely checked his specific line items, trusting him to only use it for absolute emergencies. I logged into the American Express dashboard. I navigated to the statement section and clicked on the drop-down menu to isolate the charges made solely on the authorized user card with Matthew's name on it. I set the billing cycle to October. I downloaded the digital portable document format statement. The file opened on my screen. I bypassed the summary page and went directly to the itemized list of charges. There it was. The data formed a perfect, devastating picture. On October 22nd, 8 days after I wired them the cash, a charge appeared on Matthew's authorized credit card. The merchant was listed as Pacific Coast Luxury Rentals. The amount was $35,000. 3 days later, another charge appeared. The merchant was a major commercial airline. The amount was $12,000 for 2 round-trip first-class tickets to Los Angeles. The sheer audacity of the numbers stared back at me. The structural integrity of their lie was completely exposed. They did not use my $80,000 to book the trip. They kept my cash entirely for themselves, hiding it in a corporate shell account. Then they turned around and used my own credit card, the one I paid off every single month from my own checking account, to actually book their private getaway. I had effectively paid for their vacation twice. I had handed them $80,000 in pure liquid cash, and I had unknowingly absorbed another $47,000 in credit card debt to send them to the beach without me. I did not gasp. I did not slam my fists on the mahogany desk. I simply highlighted the fraudulent charges on the digital document and saved the file directly to my encrypted hard drive. I downloaded the November statement. I downloaded the December statement. I captured every single piece of digital evidence proving their massive financial exploitation. The numbers were irrefutable. They had engineered a flawless system to drain my resources while smiling to my face. I sat in the quiet glow of the monitor. The financial investigation was complete. The data had provided the exact blueprint of their betrayal. They were currently sitting in first-class seats, drinking champagne, completely confident that they had outsmarted me. They believed the stolen cash was safely secured in Nicole's secret company, and the credit card bill would just be automatically paid from my accounts at the end of the month, as it always was. They relied on my blind trust to execute their theft, but that trust was now permanently shattered, replaced by cold, calculated data. I closed the document reader. I cracked my knuckles. The investigation phase was officially over. The data had given me everything I needed to begin the demolition. I sat frozen in the pale light of the computer monitor. The name printed on the Delaware corporate registry document was Nicole Bennett. My daughter-in-law was not just a greedy woman with a taste for expensive handbags. She was the registered agent and sole owner of Emerald Horizon Limited Liability Company. The $65,000 that had vanished from my son's checking account had not gone to a luxury travel agency. It had been swallowed by a corporate ghost, a financial black hole designed specifically to hide my money from me. The sheer scale of the premeditation began to settle over my shoulders like a heavy lead blanket. This was not a sudden lapse in judgment. This was not a crime of opportunity committed by a desperate couple. This was a meticulously engineered heist, planned out weeks in advance, executed right in my own kitchen. I closed my eyes and pictured Nicole sitting at my dining room table 3 months ago. I remembered the exact tone of her voice, the bright and innocent enthusiasm, as she talked about securing the perfect birthday trip for me. She had looked me right in the eye, poured me a cup of black coffee, and smoothly asked for $80,000 in liquid cash to bypass corporate booking fees. I had smiled. I had thanked her for taking the initiative. I had walked into my local bank branch the very next morning and wired the funds completely blind to the trap she had set. I needed to tear down the rest of the illusion. I needed to see exactly how she had constructed the phantom travel agent to steal the cash outright. I opened a new browser window and logged into my personal email account. I typed the word Malibu into the search bar. Dozens of emails populated the screen, all forwarded to me by Nicole over the past 90 days. I clicked on the oldest message. It was the initial proposal from the supposed luxury travel concierge. The sender name was listed as Julianne at Pacific Crest Voyages. I read the text of the email again. It was beautifully written, filled with vivid descriptions of sunset wine tastings, private chefs, and oceanfront balconies. At the time, I had been so touched by the effort. Now reading the words with clear eyes, I recognized the precise, overly curated language. It sounded exactly like the promotional copy Nicole used to write for her freelance graphic design clients. I hovered my mouse cursor over the sender address. The email originated from a domain name called pacificcrestvoyages.com. I opened another tab and accessed a public internet domain registry database. I typed the web address into the search field and hit the enter key. The system pulled up the registration records for the website. The creation date was October 1st. That was exactly 3 days before Nicole came to my house to pitch the vacation idea. The website had not existed before that week. It was a digital cardboard cutout, a fake storefront propped up just long enough to steal my money. I clicked on the technical details of the domain registration. It had been purchased through a cheap, anonymous internet hosting provider for exactly $12. I then searched for the phone number listed at the bottom of the forwarded emails. I typed the 10-digit number into a reverse phone lookup directory. The results confirmed my darkest suspicions. It was not a landline connected to a corporate office in Beverly Hills. It was a disposable internet voice protocol number, the kind you can generate for free using a smartphone application. There was no Julianne. There was no Pacific Crest Voyages. Every glossy brochure Nicole had left on my kitchen counter had likely been designed by her own hand on her laptop, printed on expensive paper at a local copy shop to make the lie feel tangible. She had created an entire fake company, complete with a functioning email address and a custom logo solely to convince a 70-year-old man to part with his life savings. The travel agent was a complete fabrication, a ghost entirely conjured by my daughter-in-law to rob me blind. And my son Matthew was either the most oblivious man on the planet or a completely willing accomplice. Given that the $80,000 had first landed in his personal checking account before being funneled into the shell company, I knew he was fully aware of the theft. He had watched the money arrive. He had authorized the outgoing wire to his wife's secret business. He was just as guilty, just as rotten as the woman he married. The true scope of the scam was absolutely devastating. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, letting the mechanical precision of their theft wash over me. They had stolen $80,000 in pure cash. They had hidden $65,000 of it in an offshore shell account, likely intending to use it as a down payment on a new luxury home or to fund her failing design business without my knowledge. They had left $15,000 in Matthew's checking account to cover their daily extravagant expenses, the expensive steak dinners, and the designer shoes I had seen on his bank ledger. But they still needed to actually go on the vacation to maintain the lie. They needed to board a plane and fly to California so I would not get suspicious and come looking for them at their house. So they committed the second layer of the fraud. They used the authorized American Express card bearing my name. They charged $47,000 to my credit line to pay for their first-class tickets and a smaller but still luxurious beachfront rental for just the two of them. They had effectively doubled the financial damage. I was out $80,000 in cash, and I was about to be billed another $47,000 for a trip I was explicitly banned from taking. The psychological cruelty of it was almost harder to process than the massive financial loss. They did not just steal from me from a distance. They involved me in the daily theater of my own robbery. They had made me pack a suitcase. They had made me cancel my social engagements and brag to my friends about my wonderful, generous family. They had actually allowed me to drive them to O'Hare International Airport. They had sat in the back of my car laughing and talking about the sunny weather in Los Angeles, knowing full well they were about to leave me standing on the freezing concrete curb. They had squeezed every single drop of utility out of me, using me as a free chauffeur for the final leg of their grand heist. The level of sociopathy required to execute a plan like that against a family member was staggering. They had no empathy. They had no conscience. They viewed me entirely as a resource to be harvested and discarded the moment I ceased to be useful. I looked at the framed photograph of Matthew sitting on the edge of my bookshelf. It was taken on his 10th birthday. I remembered buying him a new bicycle, remembered running behind him down the sidewalk, holding the seat until he found his balance. I had spent my entire life trying to keep him steady, trying to build a world where he would never have to struggle. I had succeeded, but in doing so, I had created a monster of absolute entitlement. I had funded his weakness until it mutated into cruelty. The devastating discovery was complete. The illusion of my family was completely shattered, swept away by the cold, hard data glowing on my computer screen. There was no room left for doubt, no room for excuses, and absolutely no room for forgiveness. The pain in my chest had entirely dissolved, replaced by a quiet, dangerous resolve. I reached over and laid the framed photograph face down on the mahogany desk. I did not need to see his face anymore. I only needed to look at the numbers. The numbers told the absolute truth. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. I had uncovered the massive theft of the vacation funds. Now I needed to uncover exactly how they were currently surviving day to day. If they were bold enough to steal $80,000 and forge an entire travel agency, there was no telling what other financial boundaries they had crossed in my name. I was ready to dig deeper. I was ready to find every single vulnerability in their stolen lives and pull the foundation right out from under them. I kept scrolling through the downloaded credit card statements. My eyes moved past the massive vacation charges and settled on the mundane, everyday transactions. I wanted to see exactly how they were funding the rest of their perfectly curated suburban life. 4 years ago, when Matthew and Nicole got married, I made a decision that I thought was incredibly generous, but also responsible. I owned a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood just 20 minutes away. I allowed them to move in. I paid the annual property taxes and the overarching insurance policies. But to teach Matthew a sense of financial responsibility, I required him to pay a flat fee of $2,000 a month to cover the remaining mortgage balance and basic maintenance. It was less than half of what rent would cost for a comparable property in that area. He was supposed to transfer that money directly into a dedicated property management account I had set up at a local credit union. Every month for 4 years, I saw a deposit of $2,000 appear in that account. I had been proud of him for finally managing his obligations. Now, staring at the itemized list of charges on my own credit card, that pride turned to absolute disgust. I noticed a recurring charge on the 4th day of every single month. The merchant name was a third-party digital payment processor. The amount was exactly $2,060. The extra $60 was the 3% convenience fee charged by the processor for using a credit card. I opened a new browser tab and logged into the property management account at the credit union. I cross-referenced the deposit dates with the credit card charges. They matched perfectly. Every single month for the past 4 years, Matthew had not been using his own income to pay his living expenses. He had been using this credit card bearing my name to pay the mortgage on the house that I owned. He was taking my credit, incurring a convenience fee, and transferring the balance right back to my bank account. I was effectively paying my own mortgage using my own line of credit, while Matthew lived completely free of charge. He had never taken responsibility for anything. He had simply found a clever way to mask his parasitism using digital payment applications. The sheer laziness of the scheme was infuriating. I scrolled further back into the archives of the credit card statements. The pattern continued relentlessly. The electric bills for their house were paid with my card. The water bills were paid with my card. The weekly grocery deliveries from expensive organic markets, the streaming service subscriptions, the premium car wash memberships, all of it was seamlessly billed to the authorized card. They were not just stealing a vacation. They had systematically integrated my financial lifeblood into their own veins, draining me daily to maintain an illusion of wealth they had not earned. Nicole was parading around their neighborhood, playing the successful designer, and Matthew was playing the thriving businessman. But underneath the expensive clothes and the luxury cars, they were nothing but leeches attached to an old man they secretly despised. I sat back in the quiet glow of my office and let the final remnants of my paternal instinct wither and die. For 38 years, I had made excuses for my son. I had blamed his failures on bad luck, on tough economic times, and on poor business partners. I had convinced myself that he just needed a little more time and a little more help to finally mature into a respectable man. But the data glowing on the screen in front of me offered no room for excuses. Matthew was not struggling. He was a predator. And he had found a willing and eager partner in Nicole. They had looked at my lifetime of hard work, my late nights at the engineering firm, and the sacrifices I made after my wife passed away, and they had seen nothing but a gold mine waiting to be excavated. A deep, resonant calm settled over my entire body. I reached forward and closed all the browser tabs containing their bank accounts and shell companies. I did not need to see anymore. The audit was complete and the verdict was final. I was not going to give them a stern lecture. I was not going to demand an apology or ask them to go to family counseling. You do not negotiate with parasites. You simply cut off their supply. I looked at the digital clock in the corner of my computer monitor. They had been in the air for exactly 2 hours. They were currently flying over the Rocky Mountains, completely unreachable and entirely unaware that the foundation of their life was about to be demolished. I picked up my cell phone from the mahogany desk. It was time to sever the first wire. I checked the digital clock in the bottom corner of my computer monitor. It read exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. I opened a new browser tab and typed in the web address for a global aviation tracking database. I entered the specific flight number I had found on the downloaded credit card statement. A highly detailed digital map materialized on the screen, displaying a tiny airplane icon slowly creeping its way across the American Midwest. The telemetry data indicated they were currently cruising at 36,000 feet somewhere over the rugged mountains of Colorado. They were entirely encapsulated in a pressurized metal tube hurtling through the thin atmosphere at 500 miles per hour. They had absolutely no internet access, no cellular phone reception, and no possible way to contact the outside world for at least another 2 hours. It was the perfect tactical window. They were completely isolated and entirely vulnerable. I picked up my cell phone from the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. The screen was completely blank, devoid of any text messages or missed calls from my son. He had casually promised to call me when they landed, a hollow and patronizing gesture meant to keep the foolish old man pacified. I unlocked the phone and opened my digital contacts list. I did not dial his number. Instead, I reached into my leather wallet, pulled out my heavy metal platinum credit card, and typed the premium customer service number printed on the back into my keypad. I pressed the green call button and raised the phone to my ear. The line rang exactly one time before the automated system picked up. A polite, pre-recorded voice thanked me for being a loyal member since 1984 and asked me to state the purpose of my call. I spoke clearly and firmly into the receiver. I said I needed to report a stolen card and permanently freeze an entire account. The system immediately transferred me. There was no irritating hold music, no waiting in a long automated queue. As a premium tier cardholder with a massive financial footprint, my calls were routed directly to the elite corporate security team. A live representative answered within seconds. Her name was Sarah, and she spoke with a crisp, highly professional tone. She asked for my full legal name and the primary account number. I recited the 16 digits flawlessly from memory. She then moved through the mandatory corporate security protocols. She asked for my date of birth, the last 4 digits of my social security number, and the answer to my private security question. I provided every single piece of information with absolute precision. My voice did not shake. My breathing was slow and incredibly measured. I was not a panicked victim calling to report a lost wallet. I was a man executing a highly calculated financial maneuver. Sarah confirmed my identity and thanked me again for my 40 years of flawless membership. She asked me which specific card I needed to report as stolen. I told her it was the secondary gold card, the one specifically issued to the authorized user named Matthew Bennett. I explained that the physical card had been severely compromised and that highly fraudulent charges had been deliberately made over the past 90 days. Sarah changed her tone, instantly shifting from polite customer service to serious corporate fraud prevention. She informed me that she would instantly deactivate the physical piece of plastic. I stopped her right there. I told her that deactivating the physical plastic was nowhere near enough. I needed her to completely purge the entire digital footprint of that specific card. I knew exactly how Matthew operated. He rarely carried his actual physical wallet when he traveled. He relied almost entirely on his expensive smartphone, using digital payment applications to tap and pay for absolutely everything from expensive steak dinners to luxury car rentals. I instructed Sarah to ensure that the card was immediately deleted from all digital wallets, mobile payment platforms, and saved merchant profiles. I told her to flag the specific card numbers so that any pending authorizations, hotel holds, or future subscription charges would be forcefully and permanently declined. Sarah typed rapidly on her keyboard, the sharp clicking sounds echoing softly over the secure phone line. She confidently assured me that the authorized user card was now completely voided across all physical and digital platforms globally. But I was not finished. I knew that simply canceling his card might trigger an automated courtesy email from the bank offering to expedite a replacement card to his home address, or allowing him to access the primary account through a digital verification loop. I could not leave any structural loopholes for him to slip through. I told Sarah that I was initiating a comprehensive security audit of my entire financial portfolio. I ordered her to place a hard security freeze on the master account. I instructed her to instantly lower my multi-million-dollar credit limit to $0. I explicitly revoked any and all verbal or digital permissions previously granted to the authorized user. I made it absolutely clear that Matthew Bennett was to be permanently locked out of the banking ecosystem, and that no new credit lines, replacement cards, or emergency cash advances were to be issued under any circumstances without my physical presence inside a local bank branch. Sarah read a mandatory legal disclaimer warning me that freezing the master account would also instantly decline my own automatic utility bill payments and prevent me from making any new personal purchases until the security freeze was officially lifted. I told her I understood the consequences perfectly. I had plenty of liquid cash sitting safely in my local checking account to cover my own modest daily expenses. I did not need the massive credit line to survive. The credit line was the exclusive lifeblood of their parasitic lifestyle, not mine. Sarah confirmed my final instructions. She told me the security freeze was officially active. The authorized card was entirely dead. The massive financial safety net they relied upon had just been completely vaporized. I thanked Sarah for her extreme efficiency and ended the phone call. I placed the phone back down on the mahogany desk and let out a long breath. The entire process had taken less than 10 minutes. In those 10 short minutes, I had completely neutralized their primary source of survival. I pictured Matthew sitting comfortably in his plush first-class airplane seat. I imagined him confidently ordering another glass of expensive champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that the digital numbers keeping him suspended in his life of luxury had just been permanently erased. He was flying toward Los Angeles as a wealthy, entitled businessman, but he was going to land on the runway as a man with absolutely nothing. The financial lifeline was officially severed. The demolition had begun, and the first major support beam had just been kicked out from under them. I kept my phone in my hand and turned my attention back to the glowing computer monitor. The credit card had been completely neutralized, but the physical destination still existed. I looked at the October 22nd transaction for Pacific Coast Luxury Rentals. I opened a new search window and typed the exact name of the luxury agency into the browser. The website that loaded was a masterpiece of high-end real estate marketing, featuring panoramic videos of glass-walled mansions perched on the sheer cliffs of the Pacific Ocean. I navigated to their contact page and found a direct phone number for their elite concierge desk. I dialed the 10 digits and listened to the smooth, ringing tone echoing in my quiet home office. A man with a deeply polished and thoroughly professional voice answered on the second ring. He introduced himself as Julian, the senior property manager for the Malibu district. He asked how he could curate my luxury experience today. I did not match his enthusiastic tone. I kept my voice flat, cold, and entirely focused. I told Julian that I needed to immediately cancel a month-long reservation that was scheduled to begin this very afternoon. Julian paused. The bright customer service tone faded slightly, replaced by a cautious and guarded professionalism. He asked for the reservation confirmation number. I did not have a confirmation number because Nicole had carefully routed all those specific emails to her own private account to keep me in the dark. But I had something much more powerful than a simple booking code. I had the primary financial leverage. I told Julian I did not have the specific booking code in front of me, but I could provide the exact date of the transaction, the total amount billed, and the complete credit card details used to secure the property. I gave him my full legal name, George Bennett. I heard the soft, rapid clicking of a high-end mechanical keyboard on his end of the line. A few moments later, Julian confirmed he had located the digital file. He noted that the primary guests listed on the arrival manifest were Matthew and Nicole Bennett. He politely explained that company policy usually required the primary registered guest to initiate any modifications or cancellations to the itinerary. I stopped him immediately. I spoke with the quiet, heavy authority of a man who had spent 40 years managing multi-million-dollar construction contracts. I explained that while Matthew and Nicole were listed as the arriving guests, the entire $35,000 balance had been charged to a premium credit card bearing my exact legal name as the primary account holder. I told him he could verify this reality by matching the billing address on the original transaction to my current registered residence in Chicago. Julian placed me on a brief hold to consult with his management team. The line went completely silent. I waited patiently, watching the second hand sweep across the face of my wristwatch. I imagined Matthew and Nicole sitting in their spacious airline seats, eating warm roasted nuts, entirely ignorant of the conversation happening on the ground below them. When Julian returned to the phone, his tone had shifted entirely to complete compliance. He confirmed that since my name and my credit profile were the sole financial guarantors of the massive transaction, I possessed the absolute legal authority to modify or terminate the rental contract. He then transitioned into a very delicate and serious warning. Julian carefully explained that canceling a $35,000 reservation on the actual day of arrival triggered their most severe financial penalty clauses. The sprawling oceanfront property had been taken off the open market for an entire month, specifically to accommodate my family. He warned me that if I proceeded with a same-day emergency cancellation, I would legally forfeit 80% of the total cost. I would only receive a $7,000 refund, and I would lose $28,000 instantly. He asked if I needed time to reconsider given the extreme financial loss I was about to incur. Julian waited for me to react to the massive penalty. A younger man or a man driven purely by panic might have hesitated. $28,000 is a tremendous amount of money to simply throw away into the wind. But I was not looking at this situation as a lost family vacation. I was looking at this as the unavoidable cost of a controlled demolition. In structural engineering, sometimes you have to detonate a highly expensive framework to prevent a much larger catastrophe from spreading to the rest of the foundation. Absorbing that massive cancellation fee was the necessary price I was completely willing to pay to sever their safety net forever. I did not waver for a single second. I told Julian that I fully understood the strict terms of the agreement, and I explicitly authorized the 80% penalty without any hesitation. I instructed him to process the cancellation immediately and refund the remaining 20% back to the original method of payment, which was now safely frozen under my total control. I needed to be absolutely certain there were no remaining security vulnerabilities at the actual property. I asked Julian to confirm exactly how the physical estate access was managed. He explained that the front gates and the main doors of the mansion were secured by a highly advanced digital smart lock system. A unique entry code had been automatically generated by their servers and emailed directly to Nicole yesterday evening. The digital code was scheduled to activate at exactly 4:00 o'clock Pacific Standard Time today. I told Julian that under no circumstances were Matthew and Nicole allowed to step foot on that property. I instructed him to immediately wipe their access code from the smart lock server. Furthermore, I told him to contact the physical security patrol team for that specific gated community and place Matthew and Nicole Bennett on the permanent unauthorized entry list. I wanted the heavy iron gates completely sealed against them. Julian assured me that the digital access code had already been permanently voided from their system the exact moment I authorized the cancellation. He promised to notify the neighborhood security team immediately to ensure no trespassers would be permitted past the guardhouse. I then gave him one final strict instruction. I told him to put the oceanfront estate right back on the open market at a heavily discounted daily rate. I wanted the property rented out to completely different people by the time the sun went down. I wanted strangers swimming in that private infinity pool and sleeping in that master bedroom when my son finally arrived at the gate. Julian agreed, noting that a significantly discounted beachfront property in Malibu would likely be booked by another eager family within the hour. Julian thanked me for my clear instructions and promised to email the final cancellation receipt to my personal email address. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on my desk. 2 minutes later, my desktop computer chimed with an incoming email notification. I opened the message from Pacific Coast Luxury Rentals. The formal digital document clearly stated that the month-long reservation was permanently terminated and the digital access codes were completely voided. I read the final lines of the legal document with an immense sense of satisfaction. My son and his treacherous wife had stolen my money to fund their ultimate dream escape, but now their dream escape was nothing but an incredibly expensive mirage. They had an email sitting in their inbox containing a digital access code that no longer worked for a beautiful house they no longer had the right to enter. I had willingly burned $28,000 to build an impenetrable brick wall right at the finish line of their stolen victory lap. The trap was now fully constructed and armed. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and took a deep, slow breath. The second major support beam had been kicked out, and the building was beginning to lean. I watched the email from the luxury estate agency drop into my digital inbox. The second pillar of their grand illusion had just been utterly demolished. But a structure is not truly compromised until every single escape route has been securely blockaded. I turned my attention back to the portable document format file containing my downloaded credit card statement. I scrolled past the massive $35,000 charge for the Malibu estate and highlighted the next major fraudulent transaction. It was a charge for exactly $12,000 from a major commercial airline. The billing line item contained the specific 13-digit electronic ticket numbers. I highlighted the numbers, copied them to my digital clipboard, and opened a new tab on my internet browser. I navigated to the official website of the airline. The homepage featured a bright, cheerful advertisement for tropical vacations, a sharp contrast to the cold and mechanical task I was about to perform. I clicked on the section labeled Manage My Booking. The system prompted me to enter the passenger name and the confirmation code, or ticket number. I typed my son's last name into the required field and pasted the 13-digit number I had copied from the credit card statement. I pressed the Enter key. The airline server processed the request for a few seconds before generating the complete travel itinerary on my glowing screen. I read the flight details with a deep and quiet sense of satisfaction. They had spared absolutely no expense when spending my money. They had booked 2 first-class suites on a direct flight returning from Los Angeles to Chicago exactly 30 days from today. The booking included premium lounge access, expedited security clearance, and priority baggage handling. It was the absolute pinnacle of luxury travel designed to cap off a month of stolen paradise. I moved my computer mouse and hovered the cursor over the bright red button at the bottom of the screen labeled Cancel Reservation. I clicked the button. A secondary screen popped up displaying a standard warning message. It asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to cancel this booking. It informed me that because these tickets were purchased as fully refundable premium fares, the entire $12,000 balance would be immediately credited back to the original method of payment. The irony of their arrogance was almost beautiful. If they had purchased cheap economy tickets, I might have had to fight the airline for a partial refund. But because they insisted on stealing the most expensive and flexible first-class tickets available, they had made it incredibly easy for me to claw my money back. They had built their own trap with the highest quality materials. I checked the small confirmation box at the bottom of the screen to agree to the cancellation terms. I took a deep breath, savoring the absolute stillness of my home office, and firmly clicked the Submit button. The screen refreshed instantly. A large green checkmark appeared, followed by a bold text notification confirming that the reservation had been completely voided. The system automatically generated a digital receipt showing the $12,000 refund being routed directly back to my completely frozen credit card account. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the empty digital itinerary. The sheer magnitude of their impending disaster was staggering to contemplate. I closed my eyes and vividly pictured the exact geographical reality of their situation. Matthew and Nicole were currently flying over the western United States, completely insulated, in a luxury cabin, drinking expensive wine and dreaming about the ocean breeze. In approximately 2 hours, that airplane would touch down on the runway at Los Angeles International Airport. They would smile, gather their expensive carry-on bags, and confidently stride off the aircraft. But the moment they stepped foot inside that terminal, the brutal reality of my silent adjustment would begin to crash down upon them. They would walk up to the luxury car rental desk, fully expecting to drive away in a premium convertible. But when the clerk swiped the gold card with Matthew's name on it, the transaction would be instantly and permanently declined. They would stand there confused and embarrassed, while the clerk informed them that the account was frozen. They would then be forced to use the stolen cash from Nicole's secret shell account just to hire an expensive rideshare vehicle to drive them up the Pacific Coast Highway to Malibu. They would arrive at the sprawling oceanfront estate, drag their heavy designer luggage up the long driveway, and type their digital access code into the smart lock on the front door. The lock would blink red. The heavy door would refuse to open. They would stand on that beautiful porch entirely locked out, while strangers swam in the pool they thought was theirs. Panic would finally set in. They would realize they had no rental car, no luxury house, and absolutely no functioning credit card to book a hotel room anywhere in the city. And then the ultimate realization would hit them. They would pull out their phones to check their airline application, desperately looking for a point to just give up and fly back home to Chicago. But when they opened the application, their digital boarding passes would be completely gone. Their first-class return tickets no longer existed. They were entirely stranded 2,000 miles away from home, abandoned on the extreme western edge of the continent, with absolutely no financial safety net to catch them. I had systematically dismantled every single layer of their stolen lifestyle in less than an hour. I had cut off their money, I had burned down their shelter, and I had completely destroyed their only bridge back home. I looked at my hands resting on the smooth wood of my desk. They were perfectly steady. I felt no guilt, no remorse, and no hesitation. My son and his wife had looked at my lifetime of sacrifice and seen nothing but weakness. They had treated me like a foolish old man who existed solely to fund their arrogance. But they had forgotten that a structural engineer knows exactly how to tear a building down just as efficiently as he knows how to build one up. The enemy was now completely stranded. The trap was perfectly sealed. I reached forward and closed the internet browser. The digital execution was finished. Now all I had to do was wait for the fallout. The bright glow of the computer monitor was the only light left in the room. I sat in the heavy leather chair for a few more minutes, just watching the screensaver bounce from corner to corner. The digital demolition was completely finished. I reached forward and pressed the power button on the heavy desktop tower. The machine hummed down into absolute silence, and the screen faded to a deep black reflecting my own tired face back at me. I stood up from the desk and pushed the chair in perfectly straight. I walked out of the home office and turned off the overhead light switch, leaving the room completely dark. The financial records, the canceled tickets, and the frozen credit accounts were all securely locked away. My work in there was entirely done. I walked slowly down the long hallway toward the main living room. The hardwood floor was cold beneath my socks. I stopped in front of the small wooden table near the front door. Sitting on top of the table was the old-fashioned landline telephone I had kept for the past 20 years. I knew exactly what was going to happen in a few hours. When Matthew realized his credit card was dead and his access code was denied, he was going to panic. He would desperately call the house line, hoping to wake me up and beg for a financial rescue. I reached down and grabbed the thick plastic cord connecting the base of the telephone to the wall jack. I squeezed the small plastic clip and pulled the wire completely out of the socket. The physical disconnection was incredibly satisfying. I wrapped the loose cord neatly around the base of the phone. The house was now entirely cut off. I moved into the kitchen. The moonlight was spilling through the large window over the sink, casting long shadows across the granite countertops. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. It was still completely silent. I unlocked the screen and opened the main settings menu. I did not want to turn the device completely off because I wanted the digital record of their panic. I wanted the phone to collect every single desperate text message and every single frantic voicemail they were about to leave. I simply dragged the volume slider all the way down to 0. I opened the notification settings and completely disabled the vibration motor. The phone was now essentially a silent trap waiting to catch their digital screams. I placed the phone face down on the cold stone counter, so I would not even see the screen light up in the dark. I reached into the wooden cabinet and pulled out a heavy glass tumbler. I turned on the kitchen faucet and let the tap run for a few seconds until the water was freezing cold. I filled the glass to the very brim. I stood at the sink and drank the cold water slowly, feeling it wash away the dry exhaustion in my throat. I looked out the kitchen window into my quiet backyard. I used to worry about Matthew constantly. I used to lose sleep wondering if he had enough money to cover his mistakes or enough sense to survive in a difficult world. But tonight I felt absolutely no worry. The anxiety that had plagued me for almost 4 decades was completely gone. I had spent my entire life trying to soften every blow and remove every obstacle from his path. I had finally realized that protecting a parasite only destroys the host. The cold water tasted incredibly clean. I placed the empty glass in the sink and walked out of the kitchen. I climbed the wooden stairs to my second-floor bedroom, holding onto the sturdy oak banister. I walked into my bedroom and changed into my comfortable cotton pajamas. I pulled back the heavy quilt and climbed into my bed. The mattress was firm and familiar. I reached over to the bedside table and turned off the small brass reading lamp, plunging the room into total darkness. I laid my head back against the soft pillow and closed my eyes. In exactly 2 hours, a massive commercial airplane was going to land on the runway in Los Angeles. The doors would open, and my son would walk right out into a massive structural collapse of his own making. He was about to experience the absolute chaos of losing everything he had stolen. But in my house, thousands of miles away, there was nothing but perfect peace. I took one final deep breath of the quiet air and fell asleep. I woke up to the soft morning light filtering through the wooden blinds of my bedroom window. For the first time in over a decade, I had slept completely through the night, without waking up once. There was no anxious tossing and turning. There was no heavy weight sitting on my chest, worrying about my son and his endless financial emergencies. The house was perfectly quiet and comfortably warm. I stretched my legs under the heavy cotton quilt, feeling a deep and profound sense of physical relief. The tension that usually gripped my shoulders had completely dissolved. I threw off the covers and swung my feet over the edge of the bed. I did not rush. I took my time walking into the master bathroom to wash my face and brush my teeth. I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. The tired old man who had stood freezing at the airport drop-off zone yesterday morning was completely gone. The eyes staring back at me were clear and incredibly focused. I walked downstairs in my slippers. The hardwood steps creaked slightly under my weight. I went straight to the kitchen to begin my daily routine. I filled the glass carafe with cold, filtered water and poured it into the coffee maker. I measured out 3 perfect scoops of dark roast coffee grounds. The familiar rich aroma began to fill the air as the machine sputtered and hissed to life. While the coffee brewed, I walked over to the kitchen island. My cell phone was sitting exactly where I had left it last night, face down on the cold granite countertop. It looked completely harmless, resting there in the morning sunlight. But I knew that small rectangular device was currently holding the digital wreckage of 2 ruined lives. I let my hand hover over the smooth plastic case for a moment. I thought about the thousands of times that phone had rung over the years, bringing nothing but bad news. It was always Matthew asking for a loan to cover a bad investment, or Nicole complaining about a credit card limit being reached. For years, I had been conditioned to feel a spike of pure dread every time the screen illuminated. But today was entirely different. Today, I was not the victim of the phone call. I was the architect of the crisis. I picked up the device and turned it over in my hand. I pressed the small button on the side to wake up the screen. The display flared to life, instantly overwhelmed by a massive wall of digital notifications. A bright red circle hovered over the green phone icon. Inside the circle was the number 75. Matthew had called me exactly 75 times between the hours of midnight and 6 in the morning. I scrolled through the chronological call log. The desperation was perfectly documented in the timestamps. The first call came in at 12:15 in the morning, which would have been exactly when they arrived at the luxury car rental desk at the Los Angeles airport. Then there was a brief pause of about 40 minutes. That was likely the time it took them to argue with the clerk, realize the card was permanently dead, and order an expensive ride-share vehicle to the coast. The calls started again at 1:30 in the morning. 10 missed calls back to back. Then 20. Then 30. The frequency increased as their reality slowly crumbled around them. I closed the phone application and opened my text messages. There was a barrage of over 40 unread messages from both Matthew and Nicole. I did not open the threads to read the full paragraphs. I simply scrolled through the preview lines visible on the locked screen. The evolution of their panic was highly entertaining. The first few messages from Matthew were demanding and incredibly arrogant. He told me to call the credit card company immediately because there was a stupid security hold on the account. He ordered me to fix the bank error before they reached the rental house. The tone drastically shifted an hour later. The preview text from Nicole read that the smart lock was broken and they could not get inside the estate. 30 minutes after that, Matthew sent a message in capital letters asking why their return flights were missing from the airline application. The final message, received just an hour before I woke up, was a frantic plea asking if I was alive and begging me to answer the phone because they were completely stranded on the sidewalk with nowhere to go. I read the words and felt absolutely nothing. I locked the screen, set the phone back down on the counter, and poured my hot coffee into a thick ceramic mug. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the bitter, earthy taste. The storm had officially made landfall. I picked up my phone from the granite counter and tapped the screen to open the visual voicemail application. There were 14 audio messages waiting for me. I pressed play on the very first recording. The timestamp indicated it was left just minutes after their flight touched down in Los Angeles. The background noise was loud and chaotic, filled with the distinct sounds of a busy airport terminal, rolling luggage wheels, and intercom announcements. Matthew spoke first. His voice was brimming with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully pulled off the perfect crime. He did not say hello, he simply barked an order into the receiver, telling me that my stupid bank had put a security hold on the credit card. I could hear the muffled voice of the car rental clerk in the background, politely explaining that the transaction had been completely declined by the issuer. Matthew let out a loud, dramatic sigh of annoyance. He told me to wake up, call customer service, and clear the fraud alert immediately because he was standing at the premium rental counter and they were refusing to hand over the keys to the luxury convertible he had reserved. The voicemail ended with a sharp and demanding click. I smiled and pressed play on the second message. It was recorded 15 minutes later. The arrogant confidence had clearly started to crack. The background noise was slightly quieter, indicating he had stepped away from the main service counter. Matthew was breathing heavily. He sounded irritated and incredibly embarrassed. He said he had tried to tap his phone to use the digital wallet application, but the entire card profile had mysteriously vanished from his device. He demanded to know if I had accidentally reported the main account as compromised. I could hear Nicole in the background, her voice tight and anxious, asking him why the backup payment methods were also failing. Matthew snapped at her, telling her to be quiet while he left the message. He raised his voice into the phone, warning me that they were standing in front of a long line of wealthy travelers, and he was being humiliated in public. He gave me exactly 10 minutes to fix the problem before he called the bank himself. I listened to his hollow threat and took another slow sip of my coffee. He could not call the bank. He was merely an authorized user on a completely frozen account. He had absolutely no financial power of his own. The third voicemail was left another 20 minutes later. The anger had officially shifted into genuine panic. Matthew was no longer demanding anything. He was begging. His voice was high and strained. He explained that the car rental agency had officially canceled his reservation because he could not provide a valid method of payment to cover the massive security deposit. I could hear the unmistakable sound of heavy designer suitcases being dragged across the concrete pavement. They had been forced to leave the premium rental lounge and walk out to the public rideshare pickup zone. Nicole took the phone from him. Her voice was trembling with barely contained rage. She did not bother to sound sweet or patronizing like she had at the airport yesterday. She coldly informed me that my negligence was ruining the first day of their healing journey. She said they were being forced to order a luxury black car service to drive them up the coast to the Malibu estate, and that she was using her own private corporate funds to pay for it. I listened to her lie about the corporate funds, knowing perfectly well she was tapping into the stolen cash she had laundered through her fake travel agency. I let the voicemail play out, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. They were actively bleeding their own stolen money just to transport themselves to a trap I had already permanently sealed. I switched over to the text message application to read the digital logs of their journey up the Pacific Coast Highway. The texts provided a perfect timeline of their escalating dread. The first message arrived at 2 a.m. Matthew wrote that the rideshare was costing them $400 because of the late-night surge pricing. He blamed me for the expense and promised to deduct it from the money I supposedly owed them for my own mistakes. 30 minutes later, another text arrived. This one was from Nicole complaining about the heavy traffic and the fact that Matthew was sweating through his expensive cashmere sweater. They were entirely focused on the temporary inconvenience of the expensive car ride, completely unaware of the absolute devastation waiting for them at their final destination. They truly believed that once they reached the sprawling oceanfront property, everything would be fine. They thought they could just walk inside, pour a glass of stolen wine, and deal with the banking errors in the morning. I scrolled down to the texts that arrived just after 3 in the morning. This was the exact estimated time of their arrival at the rental property. There was a gap of about 10 minutes where no messages came through. I could perfectly picture the scene unfolding in the dark. The black car service pulling up to the massive iron gates of the private community. The driver asking for the guest access code. Matthew confidently pulling out his phone to read the digital pass Nicole had received in her email. The security guard at the gatehouse scanning the code and shaking his head. The long, humiliating conversation where the guard explained that their names were permanently listed on the unauthorized entry registry. I knew they must have argued. I knew Matthew must have yelled and threatened to sue the entire security company. But the guards in those exclusive neighborhoods do not care about the empty threats of stranded tourists. They care about the property managers, and the property managers had given strict orders to deny them entry. The text messages resumed at 3:15 in the morning. They were no longer complete sentences. They were just fragmented bursts of pure panic. Matthew typed that the security guard was refusing to let them through the main gate. He asked if I had received any emails from the travel concierge about a change in the itinerary. 5 minutes later, Nicole sent a message in all capital letters screaming that the guard had threatened to call the local police if they did not move their vehicle away from the private entrance. The ride-share driver, who had already been paid for the trip, clearly refused to wait around while they argued with law enforcement. The next text from Matthew confirmed my theory. He wrote that the driver had dumped their luggage on the public sidewalk right next to the busy highway and driven away. They were completely alone, standing in the dark with thousands of dollars worth of useless designer clothing. I closed the text messages and went back to the visual voicemail. The final audio recording was left at 4 in the morning. I pressed play and leaned against the granite counter to listen to the grand finale. The sound of cars rushing past on the highway was incredibly loud. The ocean waves were crashing violently against the distant shoreline. Matthew was openly sobbing into the phone. It was a pathetic, wet sound, completely devoid of any dignity. He cried that they had managed to walk their heavy bags down the street to the pedestrian entrance of the estate. He said they had stood in the dark and typed their unique entry code into the front door smart lock over and over again. He described the small red light blinking back at him, denying them access. But the worst part, the detail that finally broke his spirit, was what he saw when he looked through the massive glass windows of the living room. Through his tears, Matthew told me that all the lights inside the house were on. He said there were people inside. He saw a family sitting on the plush white sofas drinking wine and laughing. He told me he knocked on the glass, but the people just stared at him, like he was a dangerous lunatic. The new tenants, the people who had rented the property at a steep discount, after I completely voided his reservation, were enjoying the exact vacation he had stolen my money to experience. He realized in that agonizing moment that the house did not belong to him. The reservation was entirely gone. The travel agent did not exist to help them. He begged me to answer the phone. He pleaded with me to wire money to his checking account so they could just book a cheap motel room down the road. He swore he would pay me back every single penny. He promised to explain everything if I just saved them from spending the night on the side of the road. Nicole was crying loudly in the background, her manicured facade completely destroyed by the brutal reality of the cold night air. The voicemail cut off abruptly, likely because the battery on his expensive smartphone had finally died. I stood in my quiet kitchen holding the silent phone in my hand. The house was peaceful. The coffee in my mug was perfectly warm. I had given them every single thing they had ever asked for their entire lives. I had built a fortress of financial security around them, so they would never have to experience the harsh consequences of the real world. They had taken that fortress completely for granted and tried to lock me outside of it. Now they were the ones locked out. They were sitting on the dirty concrete curb 2,000 miles away from the home I owned, shivering in the coastal wind, completely stripped of their stolen wealth and their unearned arrogance. They had arrived in California as predators looking to enjoy the spoils of their grand heist. They were currently sitting in the dark as absolute beggars. The stranded reality had finally set in. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for them. I felt only the deep, profound satisfaction of a perfectly executed structural adjustment. The foundation of their lies was completely gone. Now it was time to drop the final legal hammer and sweep away the wreckage. I stood in the center of my quiet kitchen, finishing the last few drops of my morning coffee. Right on cue, the bright screen of my cell phone illuminated the granite countertop. It was the 76th call. The device vibrated silently against the smooth stone, drumming a frantic and desperate rhythm. I watched the caller identification flash my son's name in bold black letters. For 38 years, answering that call meant stepping directly into a storm of his making. It meant I had to be ready with a checkbook and a sympathetic ear to shield him from the harsh consequences of his own reckless actions. But not today. Today, answering the phone meant dropping the final hammer. I set my ceramic mug gently in the stainless steel sink. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool morning air fill my lungs and calm my heart. I reached out, picked up the phone, and swiped my thumb across the glowing green icon to accept the call. I brought the receiver to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a warm morning greeting or ask how his flight was. I simply stood in the absolute quiet of my house and listened to the chaotic reality unfolding 2,000 miles away. The line connected, and the sheer volume of my son's voice forced me to pull the phone a few inches away from my ear. Matthew was practically hyperventilating. He was standing somewhere on the side of the Pacific Coast Highway, screaming over the loud, rushing sound of morning traffic and crashing ocean waves. He launched into a vicious, breathless tirade. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer a single word of apology for leaving me standing on the freezing concrete curb at the airport yesterday morning. He instantly began berating me for my supposed financial incompetence. He screamed that my stupid bank had completely frozen his authorized credit card for no reason. He yelled that he had spent the entire night sitting on a dirty concrete sidewalk, wrapped in a thin jacket, because the luxury rental agency had inexplicably canceled their reservation and firmly locked them out of the estate. He blamed me for the entire disaster. He demanded that I immediately call American Express, scream at their corporate customer service department, and force them to unlock the account right this second. He then demanded that I wire $5,000 directly into his personal checking account within the next 10 minutes so he could book a luxury hotel room in Santa Monica and salvage the first day of his precious vacation. I could hear Nicole crying in the background. Her voice was shrill, demanding, and filled with venom. She was telling him to make me pay for the physical trauma she had endured by sleeping outside in the cold air. They were completely blinded by their own towering arrogance. Even while standing in the absolute wreckage of their stolen lifestyle, they still viewed me as nothing more than an obedient servant whose only purpose in life was to fix their problems and fund their luxury. They truly believed that the frozen accounts, the canceled reservation, and the missing flights were just a massive series of unfortunate clerical errors. They thought the universe was just having a bad day, and that I was the only one who could correct it. I let him scream. I let him empty his lungs and exhaust his entire vocabulary of insults and demands. I stood perfectly still in my warm kitchen, bathed in the soft morning sunlight, and listened to the frantic unraveling of a man who had never once faced a real consequence in his entire adult life. I listened to his voice crack with genuine fear as he described the security guard threatening to call the police on them. Finally, after 2 full minutes of uninterrupted shouting, Matthew ran completely out of breath. He stopped screaming and demanded to know if I was listening to him. He practically ordered me to confirm that I was already logging into my bank account to send the emergency wire transfer. The silence stretched over the phone line, thick and incredibly heavy. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I did not match his chaotic energy or hurl insults back at him. I spoke with the quiet, devastating precision of a judge delivering a final, unalterable verdict. I told him I was not calling the bank. I told him I was not wiring him a single dime. I told him there was absolutely no clerical error at the credit card company or the rental agency. I took a slow, deliberate breath and delivered the exact cold truth. I told him that since I was not invited on the vacation, I simply decided I was not going to pay for it. The silence that followed my words was absolute and deeply profound. I could actually hear the sound of the ocean wind whipping across the receiver on his end. Matthew stopped breathing. The arrogant demands completely evaporated in a single second, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization. He stammered, his voice shaking, as he asked me what I was talking about. He tried to force a laugh, a nervous, pathetic sound, and told me to stop making stupid jokes because Nicole was freezing and they needed the money right now to get off the street. I completely dismantled his lie piece by piece. I told him I knew exactly where my $80,000 in cash had gone. I told him I knew all about the fake corporate entity called Emerald Horizon Limited Liability Company, registered in the state of Delaware. I told him I knew the luxury travel agent was a complete fabrication designed exclusively by his wife to steal my life savings. I recited the exact dollar amounts of the fraudulent charges he had made on my credit card to pay for his first-class airline tickets and the Malibu estate. I made sure he knew that I had seen the digital blueprints of his massive theft. I told him I had personally called the luxury rental agency yesterday afternoon and voided his reservation, deliberately absorbing the massive $28,000 cancellation penalty just to ensure he would be locked out on the street when he arrived. I told him I had personally logged into the airline portal and canceled his return flight to Chicago, leaving him entirely stranded on the West Coast with no way home. I laid out the entire architectural blueprint of his betrayal and my subsequent demolition. I made sure he understood with absolute crystal clarity that I was the sole architect of his current misery, and that every ounce of suffering he was experiencing was intentionally designed by me. Matthew panicked completely. He immediately tried to gaslight me, a manipulative tactic he had successfully used to get out of trouble since he was a teenager. He started talking incredibly fast, changing his tone from demanding to desperately pleading. He claimed I was entirely misunderstanding the situation. He swore on his life that the offshore company was just a legitimate tax strategy Nicole was using to protect the vacation funds from corporate fees. He lied through his teeth, claiming they were actually planning to surprise me by flying me out to join them at the beach house next week. It was pathetic and nauseating to listen to. I was listening to a grown man desperately trying to rebuild a burning house with invisible bricks. I cut him off sharply. I told him I did not want to hear another word of his fabricated nonsense. I told him the financial audit was already complete and the evidence was irrefutable. I told him he was a thief, a liar, and a complete failure of a man. I informed him that the credit card he had been using to secretly pay his own mortgage for the past 4 years was permanently destroyed, and that I had permanently frozen my entire financial portfolio to lock him out forever. I told him he was entirely on his own in the world now, and that my role as his personal bank was officially terminated. He started to cry again, begging me not to leave them stranded on the highway. He pleaded for just enough money to buy 2 cheap economy plane tickets back to Chicago. I told him he had $65,000 of my stolen cash sitting in his wife's fake corporate account, and that he should probably figure out how to access it before it got dark again. I did not wait for his response. I did not listen to his final pathetic begs for mercy. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to permanently disconnect the call. The phone sat silently on the granite counter for exactly 15 seconds. I watched the black screen knowing the silence was only a temporary vacuum. A predator backed into a corner does not simply surrender. It lashes out with everything it has left. Right on cue, the phone vibrated violently, the screen flashing with my son's name once more. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the absolute control I held over his anxiety. On the 4th ring, I picked it up and swiped the green icon. I did not say a single word. I just stood in the sunlit kitchen and listened. The frantic weeping boy from a few moments ago had entirely vanished. The mask of the panicked victim was completely gone, replaced by the vicious, snarling reality of the man I had raised. Matthew was no longer begging for economy plane tickets or motel money. He was breathing heavily, his voice completely devoid of tears. It was cold, hard, and dripping with absolute malice. He told me I had made a massive mistake. He did not attempt to apologize for stealing the $80,000. He did not express a single ounce of remorse for manipulating me, lying to my face, or leaving me stranded at the airport terminal. In his twisted mind, he was the injured party. He actually believed he was entirely entitled to my money simply because he existed. He told me that I was a bitter, selfish old man who had hoarded wealth his entire life while forcing his own son to beg for scraps. He screamed that he deserved that luxury vacation, and he deserved the money hidden in the offshore account because I had never supported his brilliant business dreams properly. The sheer delusion of his argument was breathtaking. He had lived rent-free in my property for 4 years and funded his daily lifestyle with my credit card, yet he viewed himself as a struggling martyr. He told me I had crossed an unforgivable line by canceling the reservation and ruining his marriage retreat. Then he deployed his ultimate weapon. He dropped his voice to a low, threatening whisper. He told me that he was not going to sit on the sidewalk and accept this defeat. He said he was going to walk to a public library, use a free computer, and file a formal emergency report with Adult Protective Services in Chicago. He laid out his sinister plan with chilling precision. He told me he was going to tell the state investigators that his 70-year-old father was suffering from a rapid and severe onset of dementia. He was going to claim that I was hallucinating about stolen money, acting out with extreme financial paranoia, and actively destroying my own estate in a sudden state of cognitive decline. He said my actions today, freezing my own bank accounts and canceling expensive trips for absolutely no reason, would be the perfect documented proof of my mental instability. He told me he would demand a judge grant him immediate emergency medical and financial power of attorney to protect me from myself. Nicole's voice echoed sharply in the background, no longer crying, but viciously agreeing with his horrific plan. She yelled that they would find a way to fly back to Chicago, march straight into the courthouse, and have me legally declared incompetent. Matthew picked up the thread, his voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. He promised me that once he had the legal power of attorney, he would completely undo every single security freeze I had initiated. He would reclaim the bank accounts, unlock the high-limit credit cards, and transfer the deed to my house directly into his own name. And then he delivered the final, unforgivable blow. He told me that once he had total control of my assets, he would sell my house, throw away my personal belongings, and lock me inside the cheapest, most miserable state-run nursing facility he could find. He swore I would spend the rest of my life staring at a blank wall, heavily medicated, and entirely forgotten, while he and Nicole spent my fortune living the life they truly deserved. He fell silent, waiting for me to react. He wanted to hear me gasp in horror. He wanted to hear the genuine fear in my voice, the profound terror of an old man facing the absolute worst nightmare of aging. He expected me to cave under the pressure, to beg for his forgiveness, and to immediately wire the money to stop him from destroying the rest of my life. He fundamentally misunderstood exactly who he was threatening. He was not talking to a frightened, confused, elderly man clinging to his independence. He was talking to a man who had built massive steel structures designed to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. I did not feel fear. I felt an overwhelming icy wave of absolute liberation. The last microscopic thread of paternal obligation I felt toward him snapped cleanly in two. There was no more guilt. There was no more questioning if my financial retaliation had been too harsh. He had just threatened to erase my legal freedom drug, my mind, and steal my life. I spoke softly into the receiver. I told him that was an incredibly bold legal strategy for a man who could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee on the street corner. I told him to go ahead and make the phone call to the state authorities. I told him I welcomed the investigation. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button hanging up on him for the second and final time. I did not wait for him to call back. I reached out and pressed the power button on the side of the device, shutting the phone down completely and plunging his frantic digital world into total darkness. The financial cutoff had been a necessary and effective tactic to ground them, but his threat to institutionalize me required a completely different level of response. The gloves were completely off, and the battlefield had just shifted from personal banking to the legal system. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight back to my home office. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and pulled out my physical leather address book. I flipped past the family contacts and stopped at the letter B. It was time to call my attorney, Bradley. The silent adjustment was about to become extremely loud. I drove downtown to the financial district of Chicago. The towering steel and glass buildings reflected the cold morning sun, casting long shadows across the busy streets. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a prominent high-rise building and took the private elevator directly to the 42nd floor. This was the home of Bradley and Associates. Bradley was not just an ordinary attorney. He was a ruthless legal architect who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate empires and destroying fraudulent contracts. I had known him since we were both ambitious young men trying to build our careers from absolutely nothing. When I walked into his expansive corner office overlooking the dark waters of Lake Michigan, he was already waiting for me at his massive mahogany conference table. He took one look at my face and knew immediately that this was not a standard estate planning meeting. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from him and placed my encrypted digital storage drive on the polished wood surface. I did not waste his time with emotional pleasantries or tears. I laid out the exact sequence of events in strict chronological order. I explained the fake travel agency, the $80,000 cash transfer, the offshore shell company registered in Delaware, and the fraudulent credit card charges used to secretly pay my own mortgage. I handed him the printed copies of the bank statements, the corporate registry documents, and the digital receipts from the canceled airline tickets. Bradley put on his reading glasses and reviewed the paperwork in absolute silence. For 10 straight minutes, the only sound in the large room was the crisp turning of heavy paper. When he finally finished reading the documents, he took off his glasses and looked at me. His expression was a mixture of deep professional respect for my flawless evidence gathering and utter disgust for the sheer audacity of my son. I then placed my cell phone on the table and played the final voicemail from Matthew. I let Bradley listen to the recording where my son explicitly threatened to falsely claim I had dementia, to seize power of attorney, and lock me inside a state medical facility. Bradley listened to the recording twice. A cold, predatory smile crept across his face. He leaned back in his chair and told me that Matthew had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his entirely fraudulent life, threatening to file false reports with Adult Protective Services and attempting to extort an elderly family member gave us the absolute legal high ground. Bradley explained that we were no longer just going to defend my financial assets. We were going to launch a preemptive legal strike so devastating that Matthew and Nicole would spend the next decade trying to dig themselves out of the crater. The first phase of the strike was completely dismantling their immediate shelter. Bradley pulled a blank legal template onto his computer monitor and began to type with incredible speed. He told me that since Matthew and Nicole had never signed a formal lease agreement and had been secretly paying the mortgage with my own stolen credit funds, They had absolutely zero legal standing as traditional tenants. They were legally classified as tenants at will. Bradley drafted a formal 30-day notice of unconditional eviction. He typed out the specific civil codes requiring them to vacate the 4-bedroom suburban home immediately upon the exact expiration of the notice. He made sure the language was incredibly strict. There would be no grace period. There would be no opportunity to negotiate a payment plan or beg for an extension. If they did not remove themselves and their expensive designer luggage from my property by midnight, on the 30th day, the county sheriff would be legally authorized to physically drag them out onto the street and change the locks. I watched the heavy office printer spit out the official legal document. I signed my name on the bottom line with a black pen, officially sealing their fate and stripping them of their only sanctuary. But taking back my house was only the beginning of the legal execution. I wanted my $80,000 back, and I wanted them publicly exposed for their massive theft. Bradley opened a new document and began drafting an aggressive civil lawsuit. He did not just sue them for a simple breach of contract. He specifically categorized the theft of the vacation funds as deliberate wire fraud and civil conspiracy. Because Nicole had used a digital communication network to solicit funds for a fake travel agency across state lines, it escalated the severity of the crime entirely. Bradley explained the mechanics of the trap. He said we were going to pierce the corporate veil of her Delaware shell company. By filing the lawsuit immediately, we could legally freeze the remaining $65,000 sitting in that offshore account, preventing her from withdrawing a single penny to survive their current crisis. The civil lawsuit also demanded full financial restitution for the $47,000 in fraudulent credit card charges they had racked up in my name. Furthermore, Bradley added extensive punitive damages for the severe emotional distress caused by their extortion attempts and their threats to illegally institutionalize me. The total amount demanded in the lawsuit completely eclipsed the money they had stolen, guaranteeing they would be trapped in a mountain of insurmountable debt. Bradley printed the massive stack of legal filings. The thick papers were bound in heavy blue folders bearing the official seal of his law firm. It was a masterpiece of legal destruction. Every single lie they had told was countered with a binding legal consequence. Bradley picked up his desk phone and called his most aggressive private process server into the office. A tall, heavily built man walked into the room a few minutes later. Bradley handed the man the thick blue folders containing the eviction notice and the civil lawsuit. He gave the server highly specific and incredibly strict instructions. He told the man to wait at my suburban property for Matthew and Nicole to inevitably return from California. We knew they were currently stranded on the West Coast with no money and no return flights. We knew they would be forced to endure a humiliating multi-day journey back to Chicago on cheap budget airlines using whatever stolen cash they could scrape together. Bradley told the server to wait in the shadows of their driveway. They were going to be served the legal papers the exact moment they stepped out of whatever cheap taxi they managed to afford. They were not going to have a single second to rest or recover before the reality of their destruction hit them. I stood up from the mahogany conference table feeling significantly lighter than I had in decades. The heavy burden of being a responsible father to an irresponsible parasite was completely gone. I shook Bradley by the hand, thanking him for his ruthless efficiency and his brilliant legal mind. He held my hand firmly and told me it was an absolute pleasure to protect an old friend from such vicious predators. I gathered my empty digital storage drive and walked out of the towering office building back out into the bright Chicago afternoon. The trap was no longer just a digital financial inconvenience. It was a binding legal reality backed by the absolute full weight of the justice system. My son had arrogant plans to steal my future, so I had officially used the law to completely confiscate his entirely. The paperwork was filed, and the trap was perfectly set. Now all I had to do was go back to my quiet, peaceful house and wait for the final, inevitable collision. I did not need to guess how my son and his wife survived the agonizing 3 days following our final phone call. The digital footprint they left behind told the entire pathetic story with absolute clarity. After I hung up the phone, and my attorney Bradley filed the aggressive civil lawsuits, the legal freeze on Nicole and her offshore shell company took approximately 24 hours to fully execute. In that narrow window of time, absolute panic must have set in. They managed to initiate a desperate wire transfer of exactly $2,000 from the Emerald Horizon account directly into Nicole and her basic personal checking account, just moments before the court injunction locked the remaining $63,000 behind a massive wall of legal red tape. That $2,000 became their entire survival budget. They were no longer wealthy elites enjoying a luxury vacation on the Pacific coast. They were financial fugitives living on rapidly dwindling stolen rations. They could not afford the 5-star luxury hotels Matthew had screamed about on the phone. My credit monitoring alerts, which still tracked his desperate and denied attempts to use my frozen accounts, showed a dozen declined transactions at high-end resorts all along the California coastline. Eventually, they had to face their grim new reality. Bank records later showed a debit card charge for $150 at a severe budget roadside motel situated right next to a noisy interstate highway in a dusty inland valley. I pictured Nicole, the woman who demanded private oceanfront balconies and private chefs dragging her massive designer suitcases across a dirty, cracked asphalt parking lot. She must have been terrified of the loud commercial trucks rumbling past their ground floor window all night long. They had to sleep on cheap, thin polyester sheets, listening to the roar of highway traffic, completely isolated from the glamorous world they thought they had cleverly stolen from me. Booking a return trip to Chicago was their next massive financial hurdle, because I had canceled their fully refundable first-class tickets and reclaimed my $12,000 they had to purchase last-minute fares out of their own meager pockets. $2,000 does not buy luxury on a same-day notice. The bank ledger showed a transaction for a notorious budget airline, the specific kind of carrier that charges exorbitant extra fees for printed boarding passes, drinking water, and carry-on luggage. They had to wait 2 full days in that miserable roadside motel just to secure seats on a late-night red-eye flight. I imagined Matthew, a man who threw violent tantrums if his premium lounge champagne was not perfectly chilled, being forced to cram his long legs into a tiny middle seat near the rear lavatory. I imagined Nicole sitting next to him, her immaculate blonde blowout, ruined by days of cheap motel shampoo, surrounded by crying infants and the smell of stale cabin air. Every single second of that 4-hour flight back to the Midwest must have been an absolute psychological torment for 2 people utterly obsessed with their public image. They landed at O'Hare International Airport on a bleak, rainy Thursday morning. This was the exact same airport where they had so confidently abandoned me just 3 days prior. The poetic justice of their arrival was magnificent to contemplate. There was no luxury black car waiting for them at the curb to whisk them away. There was no premium chauffeur holding a digital sign with their names. Their funds were almost entirely depleted by the budget airline tickets, the overpriced airport food, and the massive baggage fees required to transport their oversized designer suitcases. They were forced to take the public transit train from the airport directly into the city, physically dragging their heavy bags onto crowded train cars alongside weary morning commuters. The majestic healing journey they had bragged about had officially concluded on the sticky floor of a public subway car. From the city transit hub, they had to hail a standard yellow taxicab for the final 20-mile journey out to the quiet suburban neighborhood where their house was located. It was the house that I legally owned, and the house that I dutifully paid the property taxes on every single year. They pulled up to the concrete driveway just as the cold morning rain began to fall heavily from the dark gray sky. They paid the cab driver the very last of their cash, pulled their heavy luggage out of the trunk, and stood on the wet pavement as the taxi drove away. They probably looked at the beautiful 4-bedroom home with a massive sense of overwhelming relief. They genuinely believed that despite the horrific nightmare of the past 3 days, they had at least returned to their safe sanctuary. They thought they could simply unlock the front door, take a hot shower, order food, and hide from the outside world while they figured out a sneaky way to fight me in court. Matthew walked up the concrete path to the front porch with his shoulders slumped. He reached into the pocket of his damp jacket and pulled out his shiny brass house key. He slid it into the heavy deadbolt on the custom oak front door. But the key did not turn. He pulled it out, wiped the cold rain off the metal, and shoved it aggressively back into the keyhole. He jiggled the brass handle back and forth. The door remained entirely solid and unyielding. While they were sitting in middle seats somewhere over the Rocky Mountains, complaining about their terrible luck, I had hired a professional locksmith. The locksmith had arrived at the property the previous afternoon, drilled out every single exterior lock, and installed heavy-duty commercial-grade deadbolts on the front door, the back patio sliding door, and the garage entrance. I had entirely secured the perimeter of my own property. Nicole marched up the wooden steps behind him, shouting over the loud sound of the pouring rain, demanding to know why he was taking so long to open the door and let her out of the cold. Matthew turned around slowly, his face completely pale and utterly defeated. He told her the lock was different. He told her the key was absolutely useless. Nicole dropped her expensive leather handbag right onto the wet porch. She rushed forward and began pounding her bare fists against the solid oak wood. She screamed my name into the rain, completely losing whatever fragile grip she still had on her carefully constructed sanity. They ran around to the back of the house, sloshing through the wet, muddy grass, desperately pulling on the patio doors and checking the basement windows to find a way inside. Everything was completely sealed. The fortress they had taken for granted, the home they had secretly forced me to pay for, while they lived like royalty, was permanently closed to them. They were entirely locked out in the freezing rain, completely cut off from the warmth and comfort they believed was their absolute birthright. Their humiliating return was now completely finalized. I sat in my favorite armchair in the living room, listening to the steady, heavy rhythm of the afternoon rain beating against the large glass window panes. Bradley was sitting perfectly upright on the leather sofa across from me, casually sipping a cup of dark roast coffee. We had been waiting in my home for nearly 2 hours. The private process server we hired had called my cell phone earlier that afternoon to confirm the first phase of the operation was complete. He had successfully ambushed my son and his wife in the driveway of their suburban house, handing them the initial stack of legal documents the exact moment they stepped out of their miserable taxicab. We knew exactly what would happen next. Matthew was not the type of man to retreat into his house, read a binding legal document, and quietly reflect on his massive, catastrophic mistakes. He was a creature of pure, unchecked entitlement and explosive ego. He would immediately redirect his overwhelming panic into blinding rage. He would ignore the exhaustion of his miserable 3-day journey and drive straight to my front door, expecting to bully his elderly father into submission, just as he had done 1,000 times before. The heavy, peaceful silence of my living room was suddenly shattered by the aggressive screech of tires violently sliding to a halt on the wet asphalt outside my window. I did not flinch. Bradley slowly and deliberately placed his ceramic coffee mug down on the wooden coaster. Heavy, chaotic footsteps hammered rapidly up the concrete walkway leading to my front porch. Then came the violent pounding. It was not a normal, respectful knock. It was the desperate, aggressive hammering of a panicked man who still falsely believed the world owed him an immediate answer. He hit the solid oak door so hard, the framed mirror hanging in the hallway rattled loudly against the drywall. He was screaming my name, demanding that I open the door and face him. I stood up from my armchair, taking a moment to smooth the small wrinkles from my wool trousers. I felt absolutely no elevated heart rate. I felt no fear, no anxiety, and no hesitation. I looked across the room at Bradley and gave him a single nod. It was time to execute the final adjustment. I walked slowly down the long hallway, with Bradley moving as a silent, imposing shadow right behind my shoulder. I reached out and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, feeling the satisfying mechanical click echo in the narrow space. I pulled the heavy wooden door open, revealing the absolute physical wreckage of my son and his wife. They stood on my covered porch, shivering violently in the cold, damp air. They looked completely feral. Matthew was wearing the exact same expensive cashmere sweater he had proudly worn to the airport 3 days ago, but it was now horribly stained, deeply wrinkled, and completely soaked with rain. His face was pale, unshaven, and contorted with a vicious mixture of physical exhaustion and blind fury. Nicole stood slightly behind his shoulder, clutching her arms tightly across her chest to preserve whatever warmth she had left. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was matted and stuck to the sides of her face. They looked like two desperate people who had just survived a brutal shipwreck. The moment the door swung open, Matthew lunged forward, raising his voice to scream right into my face. He opened his mouth wide, prepared to hurl another barrage of insults, empty threats, and arrogant demands. But the vicious words died instantly in his throat when he saw the tall, ruthless figure of my corporate attorney step smoothly out from the shadows of the hallway and stand directly beside me. Bradley did not look like a man you could easily bully or manipulate. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and an expression of complete professional disdain. The sudden, unexpected introduction of a massive legal authority figure acted like a bucket of freezing ice water poured directly over my son. His mouth snapped shut immediately. He took a small, involuntary step backward, his eyes darting frantically between me and the lawyer. He realized in that specific split second that this was no longer a simple family argument he could yell his way out of. This was a formal legal execution, and he was completely unarmed. Bradley did not waste any time with polite introductions or pleasantries. He stepped forward holding a thick blue leather folder. He spoke with a cold, clinical precision that easily cut through the loud sound of the falling rain. He addressed Matthew and Nicole strictly by their full legal names. He stated clearly that he was my formally retained legal counsel, and that any further communication regarding my estate, my personal finances, or my physical well-being would be routed exclusively through his corporate office. He pulled the first thick stack of papers from his folder. He informed them that the documents they had received in their driveway earlier were not empty threats or negotiation tactics. He pointed to the bold text on the top page and clinically explained the exact mechanics of the 30-day eviction notice. He told them they were legally classified as tenants at will since they had never signed a formal lease and had been secretly paying the mortgage with stolen credit funds. He stated that their right to occupy the suburban property had been officially and permanently revoked by the court. He explained that they had exactly 30 days to remove their personal belongings and designer furniture from the premises. He warned them with absolute severity that any attempt to intentionally damage the property strip, the fixtures, or refuse to vacate the premises would result in immediate criminal trespassing charges and a forceful physical removal by the armed county sheriff. Matthew stared at the paperwork trembling in his hands, in absolute disbelief. He stammered pathetically, trying to argue that he had paid the mortgage for 4 years and had somehow built equity in the home. Bradley shut his ridiculous argument down instantly. Bradley explained that paying a mortgage using stolen funds from a fraudulently utilized credit card belonging to the actual property owner did not generate legal equity. It simply generated a massive criminal record. Bradley then pulled out the second heavy stack of papers. He handed Matthew the formal civil lawsuit for federal wire fraud and civil conspiracy. He clinically detailed exactly how his investigative team had completely pierced the corporate veil of the Emerald Horizon Shell Company located in Delaware. He turned his attention to Nicole, whose eyes were now incredibly wide with absolute terror. He informed her that the remaining $63,000 of stolen cash sitting in her secret offshore account was officially frozen by a federal judge. She could not access a single penny of it to pay for a defense lawyer, a security deposit on a new apartment, or even a warm meal. Bradley told them the comprehensive lawsuit demanded full financial restitution for the stolen cash, the completely fraudulent credit card charges, and massive punitive damages for their deliberate attempt to extort me with false claims of medical dementia. He made it crystal clear that they were entirely trapped in a legal cage of their own making. The financial safety net they had stolen was completely vaporized and replaced by an insurmountable mountain of catastrophic legal debt. Matthew looked down at the thick stack of legal documents, shaking violently in his cold hands. The sheer crushing weight of his profound consequences was finally squeezing the towering arrogance right out of his body. He looked up at me, his eyes rapidly welling with pathetic, desperate tears. He dropped the aggressive, tough guy act completely and reverted back to the helpless, begging child he had always been. He begged me to call off the lawyers and drop the lawsuits. He pleaded with me, telling me that they had absolutely no money left and nowhere else to go. He swore on his life that if I just let them stay in the comfortable suburban house, he would find a real job and pay me back every single dollar over the next 10 years. He told me I could not just throw my own flesh and blood out onto the cold street. I looked directly into his crying eyes and felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of my paternal sympathy had run completely dry. I spoke softly, but my voice carried absolute heavy finality. I told him he was completely wrong. I told him he was no longer my flesh and blood. He was just a convicted thief standing on my porch. I told him I did not want him to pay me back over the next 10 years because I never wanted to see his face or hear his whining voice ever again. And then I delivered the final devastating blow. I told him that he should not bother trying to beg for his old, comfortable bedroom back because the suburban house was no longer available to him. I explained that I was not just evicting them to teach them a temporary lesson about respect. I told them I had already signed an ironclad listing agreement with a ruthless commercial real estate broker. The beautiful house they had lived in for 4 years, the sanctuary they believed they would eventually inherit, was currently being aggressively sold on the open market to the highest cash bidder. Matthew gasped, stepping forward to protest, but I raised my hand to silence him. I told him I did not even need the massive amount of money from the sale. I explained that I had drafted an irrevocable legal contract with Bradley, stating that every single penny of the massive proceeds from the sale of that property would be donated directly to a local charity that builds affordable housing for struggling single mothers. I made sure he understood the absolute gravity of my ultimate decision. I was taking the multi-million-dollar asset he fully believed was his guaranteed inheritance, and I was giving it entirely away to complete strangers who actually understood the value of hard work and sacrifice. I was doing it specifically to ensure that he would never see a single dime of my wealth ever again. The massive revelation hit them both like a violent physical shockwave. Nicole let out a quiet, sharp gasp and covered her mouth with her trembling hand, realizing her entire future as a wealthy, privileged suburban housewife had just evaporated completely into thin air. Matthew dropped to his knees right on the wet wooden floorboards of my porch. He let the thick blue legal documents slip from his fingers and scatter across the rain-filled puddles at his feet. He did not scream or threaten to call the state authorities anymore. The fight was completely drained out of his body. He was nothing but a hollow, broken shell of a man finally realizing that his own monumental greed had absolutely destroyed his entire universe. He tried to reach out and grab the bottom edge of my wool trousers, desperately begging me to reverse the sale and save his life. I took a deliberate, careful step backward, removing myself entirely from his pathetic grasp. I looked down at him one last time. I told him to pick up his legal papers and get off my private property before Bradley called the police and had him arrested and physically dragged away for trespassing. I did not wait for him to stand up. I did not offer a single word of fatherly comfort or closure. I simply reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and pulled the solid oak door firmly shut. I turned the deadbolt with a loud click, locking them outside in the freezing rain forever. I stood in the entryway with my hand resting flat against the cool, polished wood of the front door. I could hear the muffled sounds of Matthew sobbing and Nicole screaming my name through the thick oak but their voices felt incredibly distant. The heavy brass deadbolt had not just locked them out of my physical house, it had permanently locked them out of my entire life. I listened as their frantic pounding slowly turned into exhausted, defeated thuds against the wood. Eventually, the sounds stopped completely. I heard the slow, heavy dragging of their wet shoes moving down the concrete walkway and fading away into the steady rhythm of the pouring rain. They were gone. The chaotic storm they had brought to my doorstep had finally blown past, leaving nothing but absolute, perfect silence in its wake. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the warm, quiet air of my home fill my lungs. I walked away from the door and moved slowly down the hallway toward my study. My attorney, Bradley, had already let himself out through the side door, giving me a silent nod of respect before he disappeared into the afternoon. I was completely alone in the house for the first time in what felt like decades. I walked into my office and sat down in my favorite heavy leather chair. I looked around the room at the wooden bookshelves and the framed architectural blueprints. For 38 years, I had carried the massive, crushing weight of my son and his endless failures on my shoulders. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind, my own retirement plans, and my own happiness to act as a human shield against the consequences of his arrogance. I had foolishly believed that if I just gave him enough money and enough second chances, he would eventually learn how to be a good man. Sitting in the quiet glow of the desk lamp, I finally realized the absolute futility of that belief. The heavy burden completely lifted from my chest, evaporating into the air. I felt physically lighter. Society conditions us to believe that blood ties are an unbreakable absolute. We are taught from a very young age that family is the most important thing in the world, and that a parent must always forgive a child, no matter how terrible the transgression might be. But I have learned the hard way that shared genetics do not automatically guarantee genuine loyalty or basic human respect. Blood simply dictates who you are related to by biological accident. True family is built on a foundation of mutual trust, gratitude, and reciprocal care. Matthew and Nicole had used the concept of family as a weapon to manipulate my love and drain my resources. They viewed my fatherly devotion not as a gift, but as a massive weakness waiting to be exploited. I loved the little boy I had raised 40 years ago, but that innocent boy no longer existed. He had been entirely consumed by a greedy, entitled stranger. I grieved for the son I had lost, but I refused to let that grief destroy the rest of my own life. I had finally learned that protecting your own dignity is far more important than protecting a toxic family member. I reached across the mahogany desk and opened my laptop computer. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark wood surface. I was not going to spend my 70th year on Earth sitting in a quiet house dwelling on the wreckage of the past. I had $80,000 safely returned to my bank account, and absolutely nobody left to spend it on but myself. I opened an internet browser and navigated away from the luxury beachfront rentals in California. I searched for something entirely different. I found a small, rustic wooden cabin nestled deep in the pristine wilderness of Montana, sitting right on the edge of a crystal-clear trout stream. There were no private chefs and no VIP vineyard tours. There was just the quiet majesty of the mountains, the cold rush of the river, and the absolute peace of total isolation. I booked the cabin for an entire month, paying for it in full, with my own hard-earned money. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, listening to the rain gently tapping against the window pane. The ultimate adjustment was officially complete. I had faced the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I had survived it by relying on the cold, hard truth. The universe had been set right. The thieves were cast out into the cold, and the architect remained safely inside the fortress he had built. My name is George Bennett, and my life is finally my own. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true family is never defined simply by biology or shared history. It is defined by mutual respect, genuine gratitude, and the way people treat you when they think you have nothing left to give them. For decades, I believed that being a good father meant sacrificing my own peace to constantly shield my son from the consequences of his own terrible choices. But true love should never require you to completely destroy yourself just to fund someone else's arrogance. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can offer is to step back entirely. Let the false foundation crumble and finally demand the respect you truly deserve. If you agree that respect must be earned and personal boundaries must be protected, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about standing up for the truth.
성공했습니다. 사실 이제 성공. 내가 방셀 남기러 가야지 이제 또.
완전 저도 방세 다 찍어놨습니다.
맞아, 쿠니 오빠 내가 방셀 갈게. 근데 예쁘지 않다. 나 분명 말했다 오빠. 오빠도 어차피 약간
궁금하다.
보라...
근데 영상은 안 찍었지?
영상으로 찍었어요.
아 영상으로? 그래서 캡처해서?
아마 움짤 만들지 않을까 싶은데.
아이고 선샤인필 오빠 너무 감사합니다.
나 언니 방송 이따 구경 가야겠다. 그 동영상 구경하려.
소리만 들려주면 안 돼?
소리만 좀 들려주면.
들려주면 안 되지.
아니
개웃길 것 같아.
오빠는 그 소리가 듣고 싶은 거죠.
소리가.
진짜.
나 영상도 보여주면 안 돼 언니?
영상?
선배님들한테 소리만 들려줘. 나 영상 보면 안 돼.
한번 보자. 일단 13분짜리 영상.
좋아.
언제부터 찍은 거예요 그거를?
나 단양이 할 때부터. 테이프 감을 때부터.
이미 틀어놓고선가 보나.